In the quiet summer of 1877, the small town of Whispering Ridge, Tennessee, lived at a slow and steady rhythm. Days passed with the hum of cicadas, the faint clatter of horse hooves on dirt roads, and the creak of the old Miller Brothers Grist Mill by the riverbank. The mill had been there for decades, older than most of the townspeople, its great wooden wheel turning with the steady push of the Cumberland River. It was the heart of the town's trade and gossip, where farmers brought their grain, and girls from nearby farms brought baskets of cornmeal to exchange for a few coins. To outsiders, it was a simple place, dusty, quiet, peaceful. But to those who had lived here long enough, there was something uneasy about the way the mist hung over the mill at night, and how the river sometimes sounded like it whispered. The Miller brothers, Isaac and Thomas, owned that mill, and they were known by everyone within 50 miles. Isaac, the elder by 5 years, was the face of the business, polite, well-dressed, and careful with words. He had a calm, cold smile that rarely reached his eyes. Thomas was different, quiet, heavyset, often seen hauling sacks of grain or fixing broken wheels. He didn't talk much, and when he did, his voice was low and uneven, as though he'd forgotten how to speak softly. The brothers had inherited the mill from their father, who died under strange circumstances. Some said it was an accident, others whispered that it was. But in a town like Whispering Ridge, people preferred to keep their suspicions folded away, like a secret letter best left unopened. Life around the mill followed a simple order. At dawn, the first carts would arrive, carrying wheat, corn, and rye from nearby farms. The river fog would still be thick, curling around the wooden posts of the bridge and the worn roof of the mill. Inside, the grinding stones would begin to turn, and the scent of dust and grain would fill the air. The brothers, hired hands, mostly young men from poor families, worked long hours for little pay. Across the field, near the line of willow trees, stood the servants' quarters and a small boarding house for girls who worked in the mill's sorting room, most of them orphans or daughters of farm workers too poor to feed another mouth. Girls were known in town as the mill maids. They were between 16 and 20, and they worked with their hands covered in flour and their skirts dusted in white powder. On Sundays, you could see them walking together to church, their laughter bright against the dull rhythm of small-town life. The preacher often said they were lucky to have work under the Millers, who were considered God-fearing men for giving shelter and jobs to the poor. Yet even then, some noticed how the brothers watched the girls too closely. How Isaac's gaze lingered when he thought no one was looking, or how Thomas would stand in the doorway of the cellar, half hidden in the shadows, as if guarding something that should not be seen. Beneath the mill there was a cellar, a cold stone room that most people didn't know about. It was used supposedly for storing tools and grain. The floor was packed earth, and the smell of damp wood and mold clung to the air. The workers weren't allowed down there. When anyone asked what was inside, Isaac would answer with his usual soft smile and say, "Just old things." Yet some nights people walking home from the river swore they heard something, like a cry, muffled and short-lived, echoing under the mill. Those who heard it often convinced themselves it was only the river's voice or the wind moving through the cracks. The townspeople didn't question much. They had learned long ago that asking too many questions about the Millers led to trouble. The brothers had power in a town that had very little. They owned the land by the river, the grain supply, and a good part of the local trade. When a farmer fell behind on payments, Isaac was there with his pen and ledger, ready to offer a deal that would keep the man in debt for years. When a family's daughter went missing, it was said she'd run off to the city or found work elsewhere. After all, there was no proof otherwise, just the quiet way people stopped talking about her. At first, it seemed like bad luck the way girls disappeared from Whispering Ridge. A maid named Clara vanished after a summer storm, her shoes found near the riverbank. Then a year later, another girl, Lucy, was gone, leaving behind only a torn handkerchief. The sheriff's reports always said the same thing: no sign of foul play. The river, they said, was dangerous at night. It pulled the careless under without warning. But not everyone believed that. Old Mrs. Darden, who ran the church orphanage, swore she'd seen one of the missing girls standing at the mill window after dark, pale and still, staring out toward the river. Isaac always brushed off such talk with charm. He hosted gatherings at the mill every harvest season, inviting townsfolk for food and whiskey. He spoke about progress, about the future of Whispering Ridge, and how his mill would bring prosperity to everyone. People clapped and drank and told themselves everything was fine. But even during those celebrations, a strange unease hung in the air. There were always certain doors locked, certain rooms no one entered, and a lingering smell of iron and damp beneath the sweet scent of cornmeal. Thomas kept mostly to himself during those gatherings, standing near the cellar door or packing along the riverbank. Some said he was simple-minded, but others whispered he wasn't simple at all, that he was the quiet kind who knew too much. The maids seemed to fear him more than Isaac, though none dared to say why. They kept their heads down, worked their shifts, and prayed for daylight. By midsummer of that year, 28 girls had come through the mill in less than 3 years, and nearly all of them had left without a trace. Their families received short notes, written in fine handwriting, saying the girls had found work in Nashville or taken ill and gone away. The letters always ended with Isaac's neat signature at the bottom, offering his condolences. No one wanted to believe something was wrong. It was easier to keep the peace than to face what might be true. But the truth had a way of leaking through cracks, like the damp river water that crept into the cellar floorboards at night. And when the first rumors began to spread about what the Miller brothers were hiding beneath that old grist mill, Whispering Ridge would never be the same again. The summer heat in Whispering Ridge pressed down like a heavy hand, thick and humid, turning tempers sharp and restless. Inside the grist mill, the air was always filled with the same dull sounds, the grinding of the stones, the shuffle of boots, the distant hiss of the river. Yet beneath that steady rhythm, something darker began to grow, like rot spreading unseen under the floorboards. The workers felt it first. The girls whispered about how Isaac's smile seemed to change when he thought no one was watching, how it lingered too long, how his eyes followed them with a strange calm that made their skin crawl. And Thomas, once the quiet one who kept to his tools and shadows, started spending more time near the cellar door, locking and unlocking it as if checking that something inside hadn't escaped. One of the maids, Ruthie Tabor, noticed it most. She'd been at the mill for nearly a year, longer than most of the others, and she'd learned how to stay invisible. She was 17, small and sharp-eyed, with a streak of defiance that she tried to keep hidden under her soft voice. Isaac had taken a liking to her early on, giving her lighter work and a small room near the back of the boarding house. But kindness from Isaac Miller always came with a shadow. When he passed by her table, his hand would sometimes brush too close. When she laughed with the other girls, his eyes would narrow ever so slightly. He was possessive in a way that didn't need words. Thomas watched, too, but not like his brother did. His gaze was heavier, sadder, as if he wanted to say something but couldn't. Once, Ruthie saw him staring at her through the thin crack of the cellar door. When she caught his eye, he didn't look away. He just closed the door slowly without a word. That summer, the mill took in 3 new girls from the orphanage, Anna, May, and Elise. They were young, all barely 16, with bright hopes that dulled within weeks of working there. Anna was the talkative one, May was shy and often sick, and Elise had a quick wit that made her both liked and feared by the others. Isaac took notice of Elise immediately. She wasn't afraid of him the way the others were. She answered when he spoke, even teased him once about the ghost stories that hung around the mill. He'd laughed, but his laughter had that cold, sharp edge, the kind that made the others turn away. It didn't take long before Elise started to notice the same things Ruthie had: the locked cellar, the sounds beneath the floorboards late at night, and the fact that some of the girls' personal things, combs, ribbons, small trinkets, kept vanishing. When she asked Ruthie about it, the older girl only shook her head. "Don't ask questions," she whispered. "You won't like the answers." But Elise wasn't the kind to stay quiet. She began watching Isaac and Thomas more closely, noticing how Isaac sometimes disappeared for hours at night, and how Thomas always went down to the cellar before dawn. Once she saw them both dragging something heavy through the side entrance, their boots leaving wet marks on the dirt floor. When she mentioned it to the others, they told her to hush, that she'd lose her job if she kept talking. Still, the unease spread like a sickness. The laughter that used to fill the boarding house faded, replaced by whispers behind closed doors. Isaac, sensing the shift, tightened his control. He started giving orders with a colder tone, forbidding the girls from leaving the mill grounds after sunset. He said it was for their safety, claiming the river was too dangerous at night. But everyone knew the truth. He wanted to keep them there. He'd walk the halls after dark, his footsteps slow and deliberate, pausing outside the girls' doors before moving on. Some nights he'd call one of them downstairs to help with the accounts. They rarely returned before morning, and when they did, they didn't speak of what happened. Thomas grew more withdrawn as the weeks passed. He drank more, sometimes sitting by the river alone, muttering to himself. Some of the workers said they heard him talking to someone who wasn't there, apologizing under his breath. "I didn't mean to," he'd say. "I didn't mean to." He'd come back to the mill smelling of whiskey and sweat, his hands trembling as he worked. The brothers had always been close, but now they fought often, their shouting echoing through the empty mill after hours. Isaac would slam his fist against the wall, calling Thomas a fool, while Thomas's voice, low and broken, would beg him to stop whatever he was doing. Whispering Ridge was a small town, and rumors spread faster than fire. People began to notice that the Miller brothers' once polished image was starting to crack. A farmer named Jonah Reed came to the mill one morning looking for his niece, who had worked there for 3 months. Isaac told him she'd run off to Nashville, but Jonah didn't believe it. He searched the property, calling her name by the river until Isaac's men forced him to leave. 2 days later, Jonah's body was found floating near the bridge. His death was called an accident, but everyone knew better. The town preacher, Father Gideon, started asking questions, too. He'd known the Miller family for years and didn't like what he saw. He went to the mill one evening to speak with Isaac, but Thomas met him at the gate. Whatever was said between them, no one knew, but Father Gideon never came back. His horse was found tied near the river the next morning, its saddle empty. Inside the mill, the tension turned to fear. The girls began to sleep in groups, keeping candles burning through the night. Ruthie tried to comfort the younger ones, but she was scared, too. She'd found a blood-stained cloth near the cellar door one morning, half buried in sawdust. When she brought it to Isaac, he smiled thinly and said it was just from an animal. But the way his hand trembled when he took it told another story. The cellar became the center of everyone's dread. Sometimes, late at night, they heard noises from below, chains dragging, a faint cry, a heavy thud. Elise swore she heard someone whisper her name once. She tried to tell the others that they had to leave, that something terrible was happening there, but no one wanted to believe it. They couldn't afford to. Most had nowhere else to go. Isaac's behavior grew stranger as the summer went on. He stopped attending church and began wearing darker clothes. He'd walk along the riverbank at night, talking softly to himself, sometimes calling out names no one recognized. He claimed he was seeing things, women standing in the mist, their faces pale, their eyes empty. He told Thomas that they were watching, that they wanted him to finish what their father started. Thomas tried to ignore him, but deep down he believed it too. Their father had been obsessed with something he called purity, often taking in orphan girls to cleanse their souls. When he died, Isaac inherited not just the mill, but the twisted beliefs that came with it. By August, the mill felt cursed. The air inside was damp and heavy, the walls slick with moisture. The girls started getting sick, fevers, dizziness, strange bruises that appeared overnight. Isaac said it was the heat, but Thomas looked more frightened than angry now. He knew something was coming undone. One night, after another shouting match with his brother, he stormed into the cellar and didn't come out for hours. When he finally did, his face was white as chalk. He told the workers to stay away from that part of the mill, saying it was unsafe. No one argued. A few days later, Ruthie gathered her courage and tried to leave. She packed her things at dawn and slipped out before the others woke, but she didn't get far. Isaac caught her near the bridge. Witnesses said he was calm, too calm, when he brought her back. That night, the mill wheels stopped turning for the first time in years. The next morning, Ruthie was gone. Isaac said she'd run away after all. The others knew better. Fear turned to silence after that. The girls stopped asking questions. They worked without speaking, their faces pale and tired. Elise, though, couldn't stay quiet anymore. She began searching for proof, something that would show the truth about what was happening in the mill. One evening, when Isaac left for town, she and 2 others crept down to the cellar. What they found was worse than anything they'd imagined. The cellar wasn't for grain at all. There were chains on the walls, stained tools, and something buried beneath layers of dirt. The smell was unbearable. One of the girls screamed, and they fled, terrified, swearing to never go back. But the noise had woken Thomas. He found them near the stairwell, trembling. Elise tried to beg him not to tell Isaac, but Thomas only said, "You shouldn't have seen that." His voice cracked when he said it, like he was pleading for forgiveness. That night, the river rose with a sudden storm. Thunder rolled over Whispering Ridge as lightning flashed across the mill. Isaac came back before dawn, furious, and the sound of his shouting echoed through the empty fields. Thomas's voice rose too, desperate and broken. Then there was a crash and silence. The next morning, smoke rose from the chimney, though no fire had been lit. The wheel turned slowly again, grinding as if nothing had happened. But 3 more girls were missing. No one saw Elise, May, or Anna ever again. By then, the town could no longer pretend everything was fine. The sheriff tried to search the mill, but Isaac refused to let him in. He claimed the girls had fled in the night, stealing money and supplies. Yet the look in his eyes betrayed something else, something wild and haunted. Even Thomas seemed to shrink away from him, avoiding his gaze. In those days that followed, the line between madness and guilt blurred. Isaac's charm disappeared completely, replaced by a strange calmness like he'd accepted something inevitable. He started talking about sacrifice, about how the town didn't understand what he was doing for them. He said the river demanded it, the same river that had once powered his mill, now whispering secrets only he could hear. And though no one dared to speak it aloud, everyone in Whispering Ridge knew. The mill had become a place where light no longer reached. Whatever the Miller brothers had started beneath those wooden floors was no longer in their control. Something evil was alive there, and it was only a matter of time before it claimed them all. The storm that night came without warning. The sky over Whispering Ridge turned the color of bruised steel, and the air thickened until it felt like breathing through wet cloth. Wind tore through the trees, bending branches and rattling shutters. The old mill by the river shuddered with each burst of thunder, its wheel creaking as rain poured in heavy sheets. Inside, the smell of damp wood and grain mixed with something sour, something that clung to the air like decay. It was the night everything broke. Isaac Miller sat in his office upstairs, staring at the ledger in front of him, though he wasn't really reading. His hands were trembling. Ink had spilled across the pages, dark and messy, bleeding into the names written there, names of the girls who'd worked at the mill. 28 names, written neatly at first, then more carelessly as the list grew longer. Outside the window, lightning flashed, illuminating the river below, swollen and wild. He thought he saw something moving in it, shapes pale and shifting like faces beneath the surface. He blinked, but they didn't go away. Downstairs, Thomas was packing near the cellar door. His boots scraped the floor with every step, and his shirt was soaked through with sweat. He kept whispering to himself, muttering words no one could make out. "It's not right, it's not right." His face was pale, almost gray, his eyes darting toward the cellar every few seconds as if expecting someone or something to come up from the dark. He tried to stop Isaac earlier that evening, tried to tell him that they had to leave, that the town was starting to talk. But Isaac wouldn't listen. He said it was too late. He said the river had already taken what it wanted, and that it would take more if they didn't finish what they'd started. In the boarding house across the field, Elise sat awake with the last two girls left in the mill, Sarah and June. They'd been too afraid to sleep since Ruthie disappeared. The storm made the walls shake, and the sound of the river seemed louder than ever, almost like it was calling out. Elise couldn't stand it anymore. She made up her mind. "We're leaving tonight," she whispered, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. "If we stay, we're next." Sarah began to cry quietly, but Elise grabbed her hand. "I don't care if it's raining. We'll go to the sheriff, to anyone. We just have to get out." But as they stepped outside into the storm, the light from the mill caught their eyes. The doors were open, swinging in the wind. They could hear voices inside, Isaac's sharp and angry, Thomas's low and broken. Elise froze. She wanted to run, but something made her move closer instead. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was that burning need to see the truth for herself. Inside, Isaac stood at the edge of the cellar, his face lit by the flicker of a single oil lamp. The room smelled of iron and earth. Chains hung from the walls, wet with rust. At the center of the floor was a wooden table, its surface dark and stained. Isaac's coat was off, his sleeves rolled up, his hands slick with sweat. He was talking, but not to Thomas anymore. His voice was low, almost reverent. "They don't understand, Thomas. The river needs balance. It takes and gives. Father knew that. He saw what happens when we try to fight it." Thomas was shaking his head. "No more," he said, his voice cracked like a boy's. "You said it would stop after the last one, you said." "She was impure," Isaac snapped. "They all are. It's not murder, it's cleansing. Father was right." Lightning split the sky outside, lighting the cellar for a brief, terrible moment, and that's when Elise saw what was on the table. She gasped without meaning to, the sound sharp enough to cut through the roar of the storm. Isaac spun around, his face twisting with fury. "Who's there?" Elise tried to run, pulling Sarah and June toward the door, but her foot slipped on the wet floor. Thomas saw her first. For a moment, something like mercy flickered in his eyes. "Go," he whispered hoarsely. "You shouldn't be here." But Isaac was already moving toward them, his steps slow and deliberate. "Curiosity," he said softly, "is what brings sin." He lunged, grabbing Elise by the wrist. She screamed, trying to pull free, her nails scratching at his arm. Sarah shoved at him, but Isaac struck her hard, sending her crashing into the wall. Thomas shouted, grabbing his brother's arm, trying to pull him back. "Stop, Isaac, you'll kill her." "She's seen too much," Isaac snarled. "You think they'll let us live if she talks? You think they won't hang us both?" His voice was rising, frantic and wild. "No one understands, no one ever did, not even you." The two brothers struggled, their bodies colliding against the table. The oil lamp toppled, spilling fire across the wood. Flames licked up the sides of the walls, hissing in the damp air. Elise broke free, dragging June toward the stairs. The smoke burned her throat as she stumbled upward, coughing. Behind her, she heard Thomas shouting, then a dull, wet crack, a sound like wood splitting, then silence. When she turned back, Isaac was standing over his brother, his hands red and trembling, the iron bar still in his grip. Thomas lay motionless on the floor, his head at an unnatural angle. Isaac stared down at him, his breath ragged, his face pale as wax. For a second, he looked almost confused, like he didn't understand what he'd done. Then his eyes shifted toward Elise. "You did this," he whispered. "You made me do this." Elise backed up, the heat of the fire growing. The cellar walls glowed orange as smoke thickened around them. Isaac took a step forward, but his boot slipped in the spreading blood, and he fell to his knees. The river's roar grew louder, the storm pounding against the old wooden beams of the mill. Elise didn't wait. She grabbed June's arm, and they ran. The front doors slammed open from the wind as they burst into the rain, running barefoot through the mud, lightning flashing overhead. Behind them, the mill was burning. The flames climbed fast, fueled by old wood and dry grain. The wheel creaked one last time before it split apart, collapsing into the river. Isaac stumbled out moments later, his face blackened with soot, his clothes torn. He looked toward the burning building, then at the river. In the flashes of lightning, Elise saw his expression, blank, hollow, like he'd already left his body behind. He walked to the edge of the bridge, the fire's reflection dancing across the water. "They're waiting for me," he said softly, though no one was near enough to hear. The rain poured harder, blurring everything into silver streaks. Then he stepped forward and vanished into the river. Elise and June made it to town by morning, soaked, shaking, their feet cut and bruised. They tried to tell the sheriff what happened, but their words tumbled over one another, half screamed and half sobbed. When the sheriff and his men reached the mill, they found nothing but charred ruins. The river had swallowed most of it. Thomas's body was found buried under a beam near the cellar stairs, but Isaac's was never recovered. The scene was a nightmare. The air still smelled of smoke and wet ash. The cellar had caved in, but what the men found beneath it made even the most hardened among them turn pale. There were bones, many of them buried in the dirt, small and brittle. Pieces of fabric, hair, and jewelry were found mixed in. Someone whispered a prayer, but it didn't help. By the time the sun set that day, the fire was out, but the town felt different. The mill was gone, the river swollen and red in places where the earth had bled from the collapse. The sheriff ordered the remains to be collected quietly, but word spread fast. Parents came searching for daughters who'd never returned, clutching bits of fabric as if they could still find hope in the ashes. Elise stayed silent for days after, her eyes distant. Every time she closed them, she saw the cellar again, the chains, the table, Isaac's face as he looked at her through the smoke. She wondered if he'd always been that way, or if something inside him had snapped under the weight of his father's madness. Maybe it didn't matter. The river had taken them all in the end. That night, as the wind quieted and the town went dark, someone claimed they saw a figure standing on the far side of the river, tall, dressed in black, watching the ruins. But when they looked again, it was gone. The river moved slowly and silently, carrying away the last pieces of the mill, as if it was erasing the evidence of what had been done. And beneath it, perhaps, Isaac Miller finally found what he'd been chasing all along, a kind of peace only the drowned ever know. When the smoke cleared, and the mill was nothing more than blackened beams and ash, Whispering Ridge fell into a silence that felt heavier than the storm itself. The air still carried the smell of burnt wood and river mud. For the first few days, people moved through town like ghosts, speaking in low voices, glancing toward the river as though afraid it might speak back. The Miller Brothers Grist Mill, once the pride of the town, was now a ruin, a scar on the edge of the water. The sheriff's men spent 3 days digging through the rubble. They found bones, too many of them. Some small, some nearly whole. They were packed in the cellar floor like someone had been hiding them for years. The sight broke even the strongest men. The sheriff himself turned away and vomited behind the barn. He'd known Isaac and Thomas since they were boys. He'd shared drinks with them, bought flour from them, even defended them once when whispers about the missing girls had started spreading. Now he stood over a pile of human remains, realizing that those whispers had been the truth all along. The townspeople came in crowds at first, curious, horrified, whispering prayers. Mothers who had lost daughters years before brought old ribbons, handkerchiefs, bits of jewelry, hopping to recognize something. Most found nothing. Others found too much. One woman collapsed when they pulled from the dirt a small silver locket with the initials C.T., her daughter Clara's. She hadn't been seen since the summer of '74. The sound of her sobbing echoed across the empty field, and from that moment on, no one came to watch anymore. Isaac's body was never recovered from the river. Some said it carried him miles downstream, others said the current pulled him under and kept him. The sheriff sent men to search the banks for days, but the river gave back nothing. It was as if the water itself refused to return him. Still, people claimed to see him. A farmer swore he saw a man standing knee-deep in the river just before sunrise, staring at the ruins. A fisherman said he heard a voice whisper his name while casting his net. Even years later, some folks swore that if you stood by the river at night, you could still hear the creak of the mill wheel turning, slow and steady, under the surface. Elise and June, the only surviving girls, became the center of attention and suspicion. At first, people treated them like victims. The sheriff brought them food, the preacher offered prayers, and neighbors tried to comfort them. But small towns have short sympathy and long memories. Rumors started spreading that maybe the girls knew more than they said, that maybe they'd helped in some way. The fact that they'd been the only ones to escape made people uneasy. Elise could feel it every time she walked down the street. The stairs, the quiet muttering. She stayed with a widow on the far edge of town for a few months, unable to sleep most nights. When she did, the dreams always came. Thomas's dead eyes, Isaac's voice whispering about the river, the sound of chains dragging through the dark. Sometimes she woke screaming, convinced she could still smell the fire. June didn't fare much better. She grew silent, thin, and restless. Eventually, one morning, she simply walked away. Some said she went north to start over. Others said she went to the river and didn't come back. The investigation dragged on for months. Officials from Nashville came down to handle it when the local sheriff could no longer bear to. They called it the Miller Mill murders in the papers, and for the first time the name Whispering Ridge appeared in headlines far beyond Tennessee. Reporters came with notebooks and cameras, snapping pictures of the ruins, of the grieving families, and of the river that had swallowed the truth for years. They printed Isaac's face, a sharp-eyed man in a black suit, and painted him as both a monster and a mystery. The gentleman of death, one paper called him. For the townspeople, shame settled in like a sickness. They had praised the Millers, defended them, and turned away when girls went missing. The preacher spoke in sermons about sin and blindness, about how evil often hides behind polite smiles and good manners. But his words did little to ease the guilt. People started leaving Whispering Ridge after that, families packing up their wagons and moving west, away from the memory of the mill. Those who stayed learned to stop talking about it. The old foundation by the river was left to rot, covered in moss and weeds. The sheriff grew old quickly after the fire. He drank more, worked less, and rarely spoke of that night. When he did, his voice would tremble. He once told his deputy, "It's not the dead that haunt me, it's the thought of how many times I shook that man's hand." He died a few years later, and at his funeral, someone said he never forgave himself. Elise tried to move on. She left Tennessee and found work in a textile mill in Georgia. She didn't tell anyone where she came from. For years, she carried a small ribbon in her pocket, one she'd found on the cellar floor before she fled the fire. It belonged to Ruthie, the friend she couldn't save. Sometimes she'd take it out and stare at it until her hands shook. She told herself she survived because she had to tell the truth, but the truth had already done its damage. No one could erase what the Millers had done, or how the town had helped them do it by staying silent. As for the Miller family name, it disappeared from records not long after. Their property was seized, their remaining wealth spent on legal costs, and their graves, those that existed, were left unmarked. People said it was better that way. No one wanted to remember, but memory doesn't vanish so easily. On quiet nights, when the river ran low and the fog settled over the valley, people still said they could hear faint laughter or crying coming from where the mill once stood. Years later, when new settlers came to Whispering Ridge, they built houses near the old site, unaware of what lay beneath the soil. Children found broken tools, rusted nails, and once a small locket with the initials MM scratched faintly into the back. An old man who remembered the fire warned them to leave it alone. "Let the river keep its secrets," he said. The tragedy of the Miller brothers never left the town, not really. It lived on in whispers, in the way people avoided the riverbank after dark, and in the way mothers told their daughters never to work for strange men, no matter how kind they seemed. The story became a warning, a shadow passed down through generations. And sometimes, when storms rolled in heavy from the west, thunder rumbling over the hills, the people of Whispering Ridge would wake to the faint, distant sound of a mill wheel turning in the dark. The river, swollen and wild, would rise just enough to touch the ruins beneath it. And for a brief moment, it almost seemed alive again, like the past was reminding them that some sins never wash away, no matter how deep the water runs. In the years that followed the tragedy at Whispering Ridge, time did what it always does. It dulled the sharpest edges of memory, but never truly erased them. The old mill by the river became nothing more than a cautionary tale told in hushed tones, a story that parents used to warn their children about the dangers of trusting too easily. But for those who had lived through it, who had breathed that smoke and heard those screams, the past lingered like an open wound that never quite healed. The legal proceedings that followed the fire were complicated by one simple fact. Both Isaac and Thomas Miller were dead. There was no one left to stand trial, no one to face the punishment that the law could offer. The state declared the case closed after a brief investigation confirmed the brothers' responsibility for the murders of at least 12 young women. Their assets were seized and distributed among the victims' families, though the gesture felt hollow. No amount of money could fill the graves that had been dug or erase the horrors those girls had endured. The town itself changed. Whispering Ridge, once known for its industrious mills and thriving community, began to empty. Some families moved away out of fear or shame. Others stayed but lived in the shadow of what had been done. The preacher delivered sermons about repentance and vigilance, about how evil often hides behind civility and charm, yet his words always seemed to hang heavy in the air, unanswered. For deep down, everyone in that town knew that the real sin had not been committed only by the Millers. It had been committed by all who had chosen silence over suspicion, comfort over confrontation. Elise, one of the few survivors, carried her scars for the rest of her life. She built a new existence for herself in Georgia, working long hours in a textile factory and keeping her past buried. Yet the nightmares persisted. Sometimes she woke in the middle of the night, her hands trembling, convinced she could still hear the rhythmic thump of the mill wheel turning. She never married, never stayed in one place too long. And though she rarely spoke of what happened, she made it a quiet mission to protect others, warning women about dangerous men, about the cost of trusting too easily, about the importance of being believed. In her own quiet way, she carried justice with her, even if the world had denied it. June's fate remained uncertain. Some said she had drowned herself in the river that had taken Isaac. Others believed she'd started anew under a different name. But her absence became a kind of ghost story in itself, a reminder that some people can't survive what they've endured even if they live through it. Her disappearance symbolized what Whispering Ridge lost that year: innocence, trust, and the illusion of safety. As decades passed, the Miller tragedy faded into folklore. Newspapers that once splashed the brothers' faces across their pages began to treat the case as a local legend. Travelers passing through the region heard whispers of the mill by the river, a haunted place where the ghosts of the murdered girls still lingered. Locals, when asked, would simply shake their heads and say, "Best not to go near the water after dark." But beyond superstition and fear, the story of Whispering Ridge revealed something deeper, something uncomfortable about human nature. The Miller brothers' crimes were not just acts of violence. They were the result of power left unchecked, of charm used as a weapon, and of a society that often looked away when women disappeared. The townspeople's complicity, their polite ignorance, had given evil room to grow. It was easier to pretend not to see, to preserve the peace, than to question the respected men who provided jobs and stability. In that way, the tragedy became a mirror for broader truths about humanity. The story was not only about two brothers who turned monstrous. It was about the small, ordinary decisions that allow monsters to thrive. It was about fear, pride, and the delicate balance between morality and convenience. Every neighbor who dismissed a missing girl as run off to the city, every friend who defended the Millers' good name, every sheriff who chose not to dig too deep, all bore a share of the guilt. The river may have washed away the bodies, but it could not cleanse the conscience of the town. Justice in its purest sense was never served. There were no trials, no confessions, no apologies. But perhaps justice took another form, one that did not come from courts or prisons. The fire that destroyed the mill also destroyed the illusion of innocence that had shielded Whispering Ridge for years. The town was forced to see itself as it truly was, complicit, fallible, and human. The surviving families carried their pain with dignity, forming small circles of remembrance where they read their daughters' names aloud each year by the river. They built a small memorial stone near the ruins, a plain marker that read simply, "For those who were taken, may the river remember their names." Over time, the land healed. Wildflowers grew where the mill once stood. The river softened its banks and ran quietly. Children played nearby again, though their parents always kept watch. The story of the Millers became a whispered warning, a tale not of ghosts, but of vigilance, of how evil can take root in ordinary soil. In the end, the tragedy of Whispering Ridge was not just about murder. It was about the fragility of trust, the danger of silence, and the moral weight of inaction. It forced people to question what justice really means, whether it's found in the punishment of the guilty or in the remembrance of the innocent. And perhaps that was the town's final act of redemption, to remember even when forgetting would have been easier. As for the river, it still flows quietly through the valley, carrying the reflections of clouds and trees across its surface. But sometimes, when the wind dies and the water runs still, people say it sounds like the faint hum of a mill wheel turning deep below, a reminder that history, no matter how buried, never truly stops moving. The ghosts of Whispering Ridge live not in the ruins or the water, but in the hearts of those who learned too late what happens when good people look away. And so the story ends not with vengeance, but with understanding, with the haunting truth that justice and peace are rarely the same thing, and that some sins echo long after the guilty are gone.